Welcome everyone to today's webinar, a step-by-step approach to actionable key performance indicators. In today's webinar, we will demonstrate how well-designed KPIs immediately inform how your website is performing. Unalytics President Peter Horning will begin the webinar by presenting a brief corporate overview. Following Peter, Eric Tobias, Director of Analytics Services, will present a real-world methodology to build relevant KPIs that provide direct feedback on the success of your website and organization. We encourage you to type in questions during the webinar, and we will address all questions at the conclusion. Thank you and enjoy the webinar. Peter?
Thank you, Karen. So for those of you who are not familiar with Unalytics, let me just share some things about us. So we've been in the digital analytics services space since 2001. And we now have over 800 customers across North America, and we've completed over 450 consulting engagements. As a company, we've also developed some technology along the way to really help the reporting and the analytics for a lot of our customers. And some of those include Montage, which is technology to extract information from web analytics tools and create automated dashboards. Also, Mergence, which is a tool to better report on SharePoint activity, and for those who are building websites with SharePoint, whether it's intranet or externally facing sites, and also technologies we've developed for better one-to-one marketing. And as a company, we work with and specialize in these three web analytics platforms: WebTrends, Site Catalyst from Adobe, and Google Analytics, and I'm told that we're the only firm in the world that's certified on all three. So now I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Peter. So to go over what we're going to be doing in the webinar today, our agenda, we're going to start off with what is a KPI, make sure we're all speaking the same language when it comes to that. We're also going to introduce KPI Carta, which is a Unalytics methodology for deriving KPIs, and it's really the center of what we're talking about today. We'll also deal with a case study that specifically comes from an existing client of ours that is a really good example of coming up with good KPIs. We're also going to have a new discussion about KPI Carta and some ways and some refinements to help you work through the logic of it. I also will be providing some pointers at the end of the presentation to help you in defining your KPIs. We won't be going over that in great detail, but it will be available to you at the end of the presentation. To go along with that, keep in mind the presentation will be made available to everybody who's attending. We'll be sending out information to everybody. It also looks like we have a few people that are having sound issues connecting to the webinar. We'll make sure that everybody who has signed up gets an email from us, and in case you did have sound issues, we will make this recording available to you. At the very end, we will be doing a question and answer period, so if you do have questions, feel free to submit those in your link clients during the presentation, and we will address those at the very end. So let's start off with what a KPI is. KPI, hopefully everybody understands, is a key performance indicator. A KPI is a number that rapidly and succinctly shows your progress toward a specific goal with a little or no interpretation or cross-referencing. So that means look at this number and then compare it to that number in that table and that chart on another page. Those aren't really good KPIs. KPIs are almost always rates, averages, percentages, or ratios. So keep that in mind. It's this number compared to that number, or this number as a ratio of that number. Those are usually what KPIs end up being. So over the years, we've determined that the best hierarchy to describe KPIs goes along these lines. Where we have measures, we have raw numbers and data. This tends to come from the actual activity that's occurring. It's recorded by your web analytics software. Metrics, or we take those numbers and we start to relate them to each other. As we said before, this as a ratio of that number. So those relationships between those raw measures, that would be metrics. Then we have KPIs, which are basically just metrics, but they're special metrics in that they describe how you're doing on a particular strategy that you're implementing. So above KPIs, we have critical success factors. These are items that are vital for your strategy to be successful. They should be well defined in terms of time, target number to hit, what the strategies that you're implementing, and then those go along with goals and objectives. So the goals and objectives, these are high-level business goals, generally tend to be set by upper management, who have the luxury of being able to set these and not really worry about how to implement them. Then we have middle management that tends to have to come along and figure out, based on this, what do we actually need to accomplish now? The analytics team tends to support middle management. They provide the reports and the numbers that are required for middle management to know whether the exercises that are being executed are succeeding or not. And then the analytics reports and information the analytics team is pulling. And then under that, we have this raw analytics data. So as you can see, it kind of follows along with the organizational structure of most companies. The slogs. So what we see frequently with clients that tend to be having a problem defining KPIs, they hold lots of meetings and they hold them after many days and have lots of consultations between teams. They end up with KPIs that when they run them for a while, they seem to lack impact, or they seem to not provide the data necessary quite as clearly as we would like. Oftentimes, the dashboards that come about from the KPIs result in top pages or other most frequent reports, or beauty pageants, as some people refer to that, where the most popular. Non-contextual visitor visit and page view reports. So just knowing 200,000 page views yesterday without knowing the context of what that means doesn't tend to be very valuable. Numbers that no one understands or knows the source of, where does the number come from, how is it calculated, or the history of that number. Or it results in numbers that have been there for a long time and no one knows why they are there, who requested them, how they are used even, or even what they relate to. So that's the problem that we see a lot of our organizations dealing with when we arrive. Why would we have a formal KPI methodology? Well, obviously it's to avoid that slog we just talked about. A formal methodology helps focus your teams in a situation where you can often run into where you have vast amounts of information. You have a variety of personal viewpoints or interests from a variety of teams and types of people, where you can have a number of possible ways to win. There's rarely ever one way to get from here to there, so that's what we're talking about there. It also involves data that is subject to interpretation. So if somebody has an expertise on how to interpret a number, a formal methodology helps to solidify that and cement that into the project. Keep in mind, a formal methodology is not intended to force everyone to line up with a particular philosophy on how to read those numbers. As we've discovered in our many years, there are very few universal truths when it comes to KPIs. Keep in mind also that a formal methodology should derive a best of breed. So it's the best of all of people's knowledge and all of their experience coming together. It should represent all of the required viewpoints, whether that's from IT, business end users, web analytics team, etc. So formal KPI methodology, we just described why we would have one. So we have actually determined when web analytics, KPI Carta, we've come up with that over the years. KPI Carta is a framework for driving KPIs based on many years. It is universally applicable. It doesn't matter what industry, what type of website, what organization you work for. We have never yet found a situation where KPI Carta does not work for a client. It also bridges the communication divide that can sometimes exist between your business teams, your technology teams, and the web analytics team, whether that's your web developers and your marketing team and your web analytics team, whatever that might be. KPI Carta helps to facilitate that communication. So this is our visualization of the KPI Carta. Again, we talked about how it is the intersection between business and technology and helps facilitate that conversation. KPIs, they're driven from the top by business goals, but they end up being constructed from these raw numbers, these measures that your web analytics software produces. A couple of examples. I'm not going to go over them in great detail, just to give you an idea how the process works when we work through it with a client. We have a very nebulous goal here, increase sales that upper management perhaps has set. We have specific numbers to hit, increase leads by 25%. We have a time frame where it says by 2012 or within 2012. Based on that, we can determine some KPIs, leads per referrer, lead source quality. Once we get to KPIs, then we kind of flip down to the bottom, reverse the order, and now we're talking about these raw measures that are required to construct these metrics that now become these KPIs. Some of those are not considered KPIs. For example, PDF downloads by registered visitor. That may be important to somebody, but that number is not critical to our goal and objective up there, which is increased sales. Another example on the flip side, instead of increased revenue, we want to decrease support costs. Again, time frame, numbers to hit. Here's some KPIs that support that. We flip down here, and this is where the web analytics team starts to be involved and deals with all of these raw numbers, making sure they're all collected and available. And then those numbers start to be combined, and then they help feed those KPIs. So that's another example of that. So what we want to do now is we want to talk about a case study where we've actually applied the KPI Carta to a client. In this case, the business goal and objective was, again, very nebulous, to increase revenue. In this case, this happened to be a client that deals with insurance. And what they have is they have specific audiences that they deal with. For example, brokers, agents, subscribers, providers. So that's the situation we're talking about. This particular goal was set by executive management during their annual review of 2011, and they set this goal for 2012 because they were seeing some exciting results from one particular prototype website. So they decided to move along this path. So that's the business goal and objective. So again, we start to fill out our KPI Carta that we talked about earlier, increased revenue, there it is at the top. Continuing, we talk about our critical success factors. So middle management then met, and based on what the executives had put as a priority, they determined that they would increase their revenue generated by the online only section of their website. They wanted to increase that by 15% during 2012, so they're still in the middle of doing that actually. So that's the critical success factor, which when we put that into our KPI Carta visualization, there it is, everything's looking good so far. However, we very quickly now run into a logic disconnect, and many of our clients have seen this themselves. How do we get from here, where we're talking about increasing revenue from online only, giving our target number, giving our time frame, how do we get from there to here, where we're now listing a number of KPIs that we know are very valuable to online content providers? So these are numbers that the industry has recognized as being valuable, but it seems rather difficult to get from the CSF there down to those KPIs. It's not really obvious. So how do we make that logical jump from CSF? We need to start a new conversation, a new discussion based on those KPIs and based on the KPI Carta. So we revisit that methodology that we showed you earlier. We break that jump between the CSF and the KPI. It's broken down into smaller steps that are much easier to follow from a logical standpoint. The way we do that is we add 3 new discussion points to that conversation. The first thing we add is the marketing phase, which I'll describe in the next slide. We add an audience in there as well, and then we talk about strategy and tactics, and we'll describe that as well. So the phase is really all about customer or marketing lifecycle, and it is all about targeting your action to where that potential customer or customer happens to be in their lifecycle with you. It consists of 4 phases. The first is to acquire, where you're getting your persuasive introductory message out to as many clients as you possibly can, or prospective clients. Once you get that message out there, so that's all about volume, then you have engagement, you're engaging them, and that means that you have now delivered a targeted, meaningful messages to them, to those potential customers that is so interesting to them that it attracts them to you to get more detailed information. That detailed information now provides them enough incentive, and you provide them a simplified process, so a simplified web experience, and you end up causing that potential customer to actually execute that preferred action. So that could be registering on your site, that could be downloading a PDF, that could be buying a widget off of your e-commerce website. Whatever that conversion may be, that falls into convert. And then there's retain, where you ensure that you have now delivered the value that you promised them, and that your product and service has enough long-term value that they keep coming back. So that's retention. As most organizations are aware, it's a lot easier to sell to an existing client than it is to acquire new clients. So this is frequently seen in the industry. A lot of times you will see this abbreviated AECR for acquire, engage, convert, retain. It's a very common concept that's been around for 20 or so years. This helps you define your KPIs, and you'll see an example of that here in a couple of slides. This is a very important part of this. We then talk about audience. This is also known as segmentation. This is really the process of grouping your customers into groups based on similar characteristics they have or behaviors they exhibit. So whether they all have the same age range or whether they all tend to click the same sort of path through your website. Those logical groupings, again, that's called segments, or that process is called segmentation. When you put those groups together and you define those groups, you're now talking about an audience. So again, knowing your audience is very important when it comes to your marketing activities and therefore your KPIs. Why do we go through segmenting our KPIs? Keep in mind that your most persuasive and eloquent arguments to get a visitor to actually perform an action, they don't all work equally well with different types of visitors. So for example, you may have a young 20-something, trying to sell them based on you're retiring soon may not be the best message. It's not going to work well with them. It's not targeted for their age group. So that helps you in that regard. There are also certain basic traits of your customers that will provide hints on how best to approach them in nudging them toward that conversion that you're trying to hit. So that kind of goes along with that previous example as well. Audience, very important. Then we talk about strategy and tactics. It's always nice to be able to do a presentation where you can quote Sun Tzu, and so we have one in here. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. It's a great quote. I will leave all of you to ponder that on your own time, but it does a very good description of the difference between strategy and tactics. So you can peruse that at your leisure after the presentation is over. But in general, in layperson speak, strategy is all about the decisions that you make to achieve the greatest overall value, not respecting what you're going to get in the short term. So it's about the long horizon, the long vision. It's a plan of action designed to achieve that long-term vision for your organization. So it doesn't care necessarily what the day-to-day is. What it cares about is what are some long-range efforts you can take. There's also tactics. These are decisions that you make to achieve the greatest immediate value. So these tend to be day-to-day activities. They tend to be very repeatable in your business. They tend to be relatively clear-cut. So those are tactics. They have the short horizon view of things. We'll give you an example. Not that I've spent any time at War College, but I have certainly seen a few war movies in my time. And so this example tends to work fairly well in trying to explain the concept to clients. So we have two armies that are at odds with each other. One really good strategy that tends to be implemented within a war is to cut off their supply line. So Army A no longer gets their supplies, so now they are at a disadvantage to Army B. So that's the strategy, that's the long-term view. How do we accomplish that? Well, one way to accomplish that, this is a three-part strategy, so there's three tactics in this strategy. The first, we increase the attack strength on the existing front. Make them think we're going to continue doing what we're doing. And then we give them a false impression of what we're trying to accomplish. So we feint away from what's our actual target. So that's another tactic. That's the second piece to that tactic. And then the real coup de grace in there is what's actually there on the third one, where we now go in and we actually flank from the opposite side of the false front that we just set up. So any one of those in and of themselves as a tactic would not be able to accomplish that strategy. But when you put them together, they all properly accomplish that strategy that we're talking. So again, feel free to take a look at this after the presentation. Hopefully this will help explain that, because the difference is fairly important. It's all about the time frame that you're looking at when you're defining your KPIs. So the solution to our logic disconnect, we need a new discussion. So now instead of talking about our critical success factor being 15% within 2012, and now we have to jump down to KPIs, we now break that down into what phase of customer are we potentially trying to hit. So if they're in the awareness phase, we're going to behave very differently with them than we would if they were in the engagement phase or the retention phase. There's an incredible difference between your strategies and tactics of acquiring new customers versus retaining existing customers. It's important to distinguish that. So we now have our phase, which is awareness. We have an audience. For this particular client, their international user base is very, very small. And it has a completely different marketing viewpoint or marketing standpoint than it would if you were US visitors. So one of the first things that they do is they break it down into US based and international visitors. So that's an audience for them. One of the strategies that they determined was most relevant was to optimize their existing campaign efforts. So they're obviously executing campaigns already. They're spending a lot of effort and a lot of man hours and a lot of cost involved with trying to execute these different campaigns. So let's optimize what they're already trying to do. So that's, again, not a day-to-day decision. That's something that you execute over months or 6 months or a year. And a tactic toward trying to accomplish that is to implement a detailed hierarchy. And I'm not going to get into what a detailed hierarchy is in web analytics, but needless to say, it gives you a lot more detailed information on how well your campaign activities are performing. That would be a tactic. That's something that you can implement within a short horizon. You can do that within a few weeks, perhaps, for some organizations. So that's an awareness phase type of activity. We also have engagement phase. So this is yet another way to look at that. The engagement, again, they were looking at US visitors. That was a prime focus for them. Another strategy they determined was relevant was to expose high value, which is to say more targeted content. So instead of having general industry documents that are available all over the place, to have really targeted content that really goes to whatever audience they're looking at. So perhaps brokers or agents or subscribers. So that, again, that's a long-term horizon. A short-term horizon, let's implement activity-based content serving. That's a common abbreviation out there, ABCS, which you'll see in a diagram I'll be showing here in a second. Activity-based content serving says that there are certain types of content and the community will assist you with determining what is most relevant. So that includes giving ratings to articles or forwarding it to a friend or giving it a bump, for example, a nudge or a like, something like that. So all of that put together helps you to expose your best content for the different types of people that you have. So that's activity-based content serving. So that certainly is something that you can implement on a day-to-day basis that, again, goes toward getting that high-value targeted content out to the right audience. Another way to increase their revenue in this particular case, this website sold ad space on their website. So they talked about increasing their impressions. And when you're talking about increasing impressions, you're talking about the number of times that you display an ad to a potential client that's out there. Not necessarily your client, unless it's your advertising, but that is essentially what the impression is. So if you have more impressions going out there, that gives you the ability to charge more, and the more you can charge, the more revenue that you bring in. That goes toward that goal we talked about. Again, that's not something you can do day to day, so that's something that takes some time. So going toward increasing the impressions, we break that down into something called increasing ad inventory. So this is now a tactic. This is something you can do on a short horizon. So instead of having 1,000 ads out there that you can display on your website, now you have 5,000 ads that you can display. The more ad content that you have, the more impressions, the more revenue. So that follows along that line of strategy. In this particular case, for broker visitors, this client noticed that the price they could charge for an ad impression for a specific type of visitor, which is a broker visitor, they could get a lot more money for that because those broker visitors are far more valuable to their advertisers than perhaps other visitor types are. So in this case, if they can increase the number of broker visitors, then the average cost per impression will go considerably higher, which will increase the revenue. And I see that somebody's asked what an impression is. An impression is essentially the displaying of an ad to a visitor. It doesn't necessarily say whether they saw the ad or responded to that ad. An impression just says that that advertisement was actually physically displayed on the website and the visitor had the opportunity to view that. So that's what an impression is, to answer that question. So take a look at this whole hierarchy. This is now everything that falls in between the critical success factor of increase 15% in 2012 down through the KPIs. So we've had to take a few steps to get there, but these are much smaller steps, and it's a lot easier to make that leap between the two. So let's look at that a slightly different way. We have the possibility of increasing revenue up there at the top. That was the goal that was set. Again, there's our critical success factor we talked about, increase the revenue by 15% in 2012. And then we talked about, again, as we said, AECR as being the phase that the customer or potential customer tends to fall into, or in this case, the activity that you're executing falls in. This client actually did a lot of work, and they did further refinements in conversion and retention, but I'm not displaying those in this particular diagram just to keep things smaller and a little easier to read. If you do have trouble viewing this through your browser, this will be available again via download, so you can zoom in on that and get a better view of it. But phases, we talked about breaking down into audiences. So there's the US visitors we talked about. Another type of audience they referred to as commercial visitors. They did provide an e-commerce section of their site, so there were commercial visitors to the site in question. Again, that's out of scope of this particular webinar that we're doing, but it is certainly valuable to them. Then we break our strategies and we break our tactics down. So there's that abbreviation down in tactic that I mentioned before, implement ABCS. So that's the activity-based content serving. So you can see that that is a tactic that was aligned with the strategy of exposing more targeted content, which was related to the audience of US visitors, which was related to engagement. So you can see how you follow that up all the way back to the original business goal and objective. And then down there at the bottom, we've kind of highlighted some of those KPIs that we identified earlier. So we talked about the average visits per broker. That was on one of the prior slides, or the average bumps per article, which you see there under implement ABCS. So that leap that we talked about is now a lot easier, and it's a lot easier then to go up the chain from that and figure out how did we get here. So that gives you a lot of historical perspective and allows you to avoid some of those issues we saw in the slog earlier. So this is just another way of viewing the same exercises we've been going through. Then we're going to take yet another view of the exact same information. This now looks like an Excel spreadsheet, because it is. In this particular case, we have now turned it on its side, and we have our business goals and objectives there, our critical success factors. We break things down into the marketing aspect, or the phase, as we called it. And then we have audience and strategy, and there's tactic over there. And you'll notice, for example, they did have international visitors listed there. Then they have commercial clients down at the bottom. So they did have other audiences they'd identified. They have different strategies, certifying visitor base. So there's some information in there that is very helpful. So that all aligns kind of with what we've been showing earlier. This is actually the worksheet that we use when we go through this exercise. What we've gone through so far is, this will be a 30-minute presentation. And normally when we do this sort of presentation, this tends to be more of a 2 or 3 day activity, depending on the organization. We would hold various different meetings with stakeholders, and we go through the worksheet a number of different times, and we refine it over a couple of days. So we're really trying to fit a whole bunch of information in here fairly quickly. Just get the concept through to everybody. But this is actually the type of worksheet that we use when we go through that, and this is the type of thing that we deliver at the end of that. So this is a very helpful sort of worksheet, I think, that helps to illustrate the concept and helps organizations work through the KPI Carta. I also wanted to provide a few pointers as well. This is not information I'm going to go through in great detail, but certainly if you want actionable KPIs, some things you should keep in mind. These are best practices around the industry and from our own experience with consulting, as we said, with 800 different clients along these lines. A good KPI should be suitable for your specific business, industry, or organization. As I said earlier, there are very few universal KPIs, so this is a good place to note that. It should be related to business goals and objectives. Magic KPIs that appear from nowhere don't help anybody because they don't know why they're there, or where they came from, or what purpose they serve. A good KPI should make it possible to influence the business. That's why we say, for example, that page views is not a good KPI. What can you do to influence the business based on knowing yesterday we had 200,000 page views and today we had 221,000 page views? It depends on a lot of different things as to whether that's good or bad. So just knowing that number, it doesn't make it possible to influence your business. Not a good KPI. KPIs should be easy to quantify. It shouldn't take a statistics degree to get through this. This should be numbers that are easy to collect, or numbers that are easy to divide or subtract or take percentages of or fractions of, that sort of stuff. Should be easy to quantify. You should always link to other relevant data. KPIs are rarely ever good as an island. They always relate to something else. So that should always be taken into account. You should always be able to compare your KPIs over time. If you can't compare them over time, you don't know how things are changing. Are they better? Are they worse? How are things improving or not improving? What changes do we need to make? So they should always be comparable over time. The best organizations that have good governance have a dedicated, committed owner for their KPIs, somebody who's responsible for reporting that KPI throughout the organization. Certainly governance is a portion of it that we won't be able to go over during this, but this is something we would normally go over during a KPI Carta workshop that we do with clients. And governance, we have plenty of information on that. If you would like that, feel free to contact us about that. A dedicated, committed owner, it's very important. No presentation is all that great without having a number of acronyms thrown at it. We've already talked about AECR. Let's throw in a few more so we get some acronym soup going. Define SMART KPIs. I'll list that here in a second. That is one that's fairly industry common. One that we've defined for ourselves over the years is called RADAR. That's how you consume your KPIs. I'm not going to go into these in great detail simply because we're running out of time, but I did want to list them on the slide, so feel free to review them after the webinar is over. SMART KPIs, they should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Very important, I think, for any good KPIs. Radar, so this is how you consume your KPIs. You should report on your numbers, analyze them, make decisions based on them, act on those numbers, and then repeat the whole process. So this is a continuous quality improvement process whereby you refine your KPIs to where they're absolutely optimal for what your needs are. So Radar, again, feel free to review that after the presentation or after the webinar. KPI discussions, sometimes we find that there's a number of questions that we can ask that will help facilitate those KPI discussions and get things moving along a little better. I'm not going to read all of these. These will be available after the webinar is over. We ended up actually listing, I think 12 of them, or maybe 10 of them. So here's 4 questions that are very helpful. And then on this slide, we continue a few more questions. So on here, we have 6 questions that we find are very helpful. So at this time, it's time to actually, we also have some resources that have been provided here. Feel free to type these links in. These will all lead you to, in this case, we have a few blogs that we find to be very useful. A couple of those blogs were written by Unalytics staff, so those would be very helpful for you. I highly recommend looking at those. We also have one in there that is from an industry source that we found to be very helpful and help people make progress on their KPIs. If you have not heard of KPI Library, it's definitely worth checking that out. That's a service that we are aware of that helps organizations define their KPIs a bit better. So there's a link there. There's also a number of services that Unalytics provides that also go along helping with actionable KPIs. KPI Carta we've just mentioned. As we've said, that is also a service that we offer companies, and we've done this numerous times with organizations. Again, whether it's a 1, 2, or 3 day setting with various workshops. So there's a URL there for you to follow where you can go and check that out. Sorry about that. We also have Montage, which is software that we've created to help automate dashboard creation. Actually not creation, but presentation. So feel free to go check that out. That's also very helpful because KPIs that you have to manually construct over and over, month after month or week after week, tend to become a problem for most organizations. And then as SharePoint and analytics, if you do have SharePoint and you would like to know who's using the favorite features or the links feature or the ratings feature or any of that sort of stuff and you need those sort of analytics, there's another URL for you as well. So let's see what we have as far as Q&A. Looks like we had one question that was already answered, so that's good. We have another question on who owns ad inventory. Ad inventory tends to be owned depending on the organization. In some organizations, we see that that's owned by a marketing person, where they are in charge of the ad inventory. In other organizations, it's owned by the website administrators, whether that tends to be IT or a semi-technical business unit. So in those particular situations, it really depends on the organization. And sometimes they even share responsibility where marketing is responsible for filling ad inventory and then IT or a technical team is responsible for placing that inventory on the website. So it really depends on the organization. Another question that came up is all about, let's see, why would we have Unalytics come in and help with deriving these KPIs? Can we just use the methodology on our own? Well, certainly you can absolutely do that. That is not a problem to do that. We think the methodology is certainly clear and useful for everybody. There are certainly some details that tend to come out that just industry experience assists with. We certainly have a large amount of industry experience. So for example, activity-based content surveying, we can provide a lot of assistance with that and help people and organizations shortcut through that so that they don't have all the time and learning that it takes to be able to get there. So that's all that we have. I don't see any other questions. So for everybody that is out there, thank you for attending. This presentation will be made available for everybody. Keep in mind that if you have had any audio problems when you initially joined, we certainly apologize for that. And you should hopefully get that through our recording that we made. The presentation will also be available to you on the website. Everyone who signed up will get an email from us with information on how to access that. If you have any questions that we have not had a chance to answer, please feel free to contact us back on that email address. Or just generally on our website. You can go to www.unalytics.com and send us a question there. We'd be happy to answer it. Again, thank you everybody for attending today. Hopefully you've gotten a lot of good information out of this, and good luck with your KPIs.